Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. In my last video, I started what will be a very informal three-part discussion of rereading. The first video was a celebration of Steve Donohue's annual rereading of Homer's Odyssey, where I talked about how various translators portrayed the main character Odysseus. The last video in the series, which I hope to have out early this coming week, will be about a couple of books published this year about rereading. And today, I'm thrilled to be doing the Reread Tag, a brilliant set of prompts put out by Roz at Scallydandling about the books. Let's get on to the questions. Question number 1. Assuming you're a rereader, where do you sit on the reading scale from almost never to all the time? I reread fairly frequently in general, but what rereading means can vary a great deal, depending on the circumstances. Sometimes I plan for a deep reread and dive in with pencil in hand. Sometimes I trip across a book on my shelves at just the right moment and pick it up, sometimes for a full but quick reread, and sometimes for just a quick jaunt through favorite scenes. I think some of the future questions get into this a little more. If I had more time to read, or if I read a lot faster, I think I would reread quite a bit more. Incidentally, I almost never use the word reread, and instead just say I'm reading the book again. I suspect I will continue to use that phrasing, but this tag, and the labeling feature on Goodreads, and one of the books I'm going to talk about in the next rereading series video have made me think about what the differences are between first reads and rereads, and whether those differences are large enough that I need to distinguish between them in my everyday language, or just occasionally when the rereading part is actually part of the discussion. Interesting question. If you have any thoughts on this issue, I'd love to hear your ideas. Next question. Have your rereading habits changed over your reading life? Not really, I don't think. Actually, I might have reread a bit less this year, my first year on BookTube. Strangely enough, I can imagine that if I had not been making commitments to read with specific people, or making plans to participate in a particular reading challenge, I might be spending the entire pandemic reading and rereading Jane Eyre and maybe Emily Dickinson again and again. Thanks for keeping me from that path, I think. Prompt number 3. When do you reread? Maybe immediately after finishing a book, or not till years later, or when the mood strikes. Yes, to all three, I think. Sometimes I read books again many years after the initial read, and often I only remember bits, maybe the personality of a major character or two, and the bare bones of the plot. As I read, so much can come back to me, not only the details about what's happening in the book, but what things jumped out at me when I read it initially, and even what things were going on in my life aside from reading when I first read the book. Fairly recently, for example, I looked through Margaret Atwood's book, The Handmaid's Tale, after almost 30 years since I read it initially. I may have mentioned it on here before once that I didn't love it, but did absolutely love discussing it for a class, talking about portrayals of race and gender in history. Because I got started a bit late, I read the book in one sitting, the day before class. When I was going back through it recently, all sorts of memories kept flooding in. The tweedy blue fabric of the couch in my furnished apartment. The Irish breakfast tea in my grandmother's 1970s avocado green teapot, tea that I poured for myself again and again throughout that day. The tiny spearmint plant that I watered in the middle of the day, watering can in one hand and book in the other. And then I remembered conversations in the hall right before class began with school friends, including the man who dropped out of our graduate program to start the Unemployed Philosophers Guild, which I will link to in the description box. Great place to go for everything from finger puppets of Edgar Allan Poe, Sylvia Plath, Dorothy Parker, or even Foucault and Derrida, to votive candles to James Baldwin or Virginia Woolf. I love how much books can take us back. Well, back to the question. Sorry. Do you ever start at the beginning right after finishing a book? I don't think I've literally started again at the beginning, but I've definitely thought about it. Not usually because I love the book so much I just want to keep living in it, but because it seems like a book where the ending was subtly projected all along, and that although I had no idea what those details signaled when I first read them, there were clues throughout, clues I saw only as I looked back. During Jane Austen July, a lot of you talked about how Jane Austen does this so cleverly in her novel Emma, for example. Another reason I might reread a book immediately after finishing is perhaps cheating for this tag. There definitely are times when I'll read one translation and then immediately pick up another translation. Sometimes I even just read one chapter over and over, or even one sentence over and over, as I kind of did for my last video about the Odyssey, in a bunch of different translations. Does that count as a reread? Not exactly. Yes, it is the same book, but no, it isn't the same book. Onwards. Question 4. Why do you reread books? Sometimes because I know I love a book. Sometimes because I know I always notice new things about a book, and I'm ready to approach that book in a new way, again, with open eyes. Sometimes because I have fond memories of the time I read it first, and I want to celebrate that moment. Sometimes because I know I didn't appreciate a book as much as other people did, and when I think I have more understanding, or whatever, I try again. And of course, some books seem made for rereading. As many of you have mentioned, a lot of us read the Bible again and again. Within Judaism, there's a tradition of reading particular sections in a clear order throughout the year, one section every week, along with other parallel texts. Another kind of literature that begs for rereading is poetry. I mentioned that Emily Dickinson is a personal favorite. I'm really fascinated with how children read and reread books again and again, and how those books often continue to repay rereading even after we're adults. And actually, that brings me to some of my favorite rereads, books I read as a child and then later shared with my son. Often books I read to my son that were also books I had read to my brother when he was young, and even books that were new to me that I read again and again to my son. And then, as my son grew up, we continued to read together. He homeschooled, much to our surprise, which is a whole nother story, but it meant I got to reread a lot of classics as he worked through them for the first time. And I read a lot of classics I had not read before, too, with my son as a reading partner. Seeing books through this multi-lens, thinking about what it felt like to read a particular book when I was young, how it felt now, how my son was seeing it, and to a degree how to teach those works was really fascinating. The next question asks, how do you reread? Faster, slower, just the best bits? All of the above, actually, depending on the book and on the situation of the rereading. Sometimes I go to books specifically looking for particular scenes, sometimes because a discussion with a fellow reader makes me rethink what was in my head, or a screen adaptation makes me want to be more precise about exactly what was similar or different, or because a new book or new-to-me book makes me remember a passage that I want to compare more precisely than I could compare if I were relying only on my sometimes erratic and quirky memory. Recently, as I was sorting books in an effort to make room for my son to have a place to zoom into his classes after his college sent students home in March, I sorted through a lot of my old books and often found myself reading favorite passages. Sometimes I had slipped a tab in to mark a section, and sometimes the books just seemed to fall open to well-loved parts. I think I mentioned not too long ago that one book sucked me in completely, Toni Morrison's nonfiction, Playing in the Dark, and I did a very quick reread of the very short book while standing next to the shelves I was supposedly clearing. I haven't yet reread it again, a read which will be done much more carefully this time, with pencil in hand, but I had promised myself I will, perhaps in January when Toni Morrison 2020 has wrapped up. Prompt 6. Who or what do you reread, more specifically? Which authors or genres or individual books? All of Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor. Lots of different poetry. A new-to-me author, at least for her fiction, is Virginia Woolf, but I can imagine she will enter my stack of books that are read frequently. George Eliot might be moved to that figurative shelf as well. Okay, question 7 asks if there's a book you found better when you reread it. I'm going to give an answer from this year. I read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye when one of my college friends recommended it to me way back in the late 1980s. I loved it then, but when I reread it this year, I appreciated it even more. I wish I had written about it then, a paper or a review, or just in my reading diary or journal. I'm not sure why I saw it as an even more stunning work of writing this time than I did back then, perhaps because I understand more about how fiction has worked historically and how contemporary writers were reshaping that tradition. I'm not sure. Don't get me wrong, I would have given that book 5 stars on Goodreads if Goodreads had been around back then. But even so, The Bluest Eye felt even more powerful to me this time, and much more interesting from a literary angle. Question 8 is sort of the flip side of 7. Is there a book you found worse when you reread it? Again, I'll choose one from this year, and sadly the book was Mama Day by Gloria Naylor. I made my spouse read the book when we were first dating, and he loved it about as much as I did way back then. I was absolutely heartbroken that after all these years of remembering it as a magical and transformative read, I thought it had really not held up well. If I can figure out where I talked about it more, which video it was in, I will link to it below. And the last prompt, prompt number 9, which one book have you reread most times? I think it might be a tie. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Louisa May Alcott's 2-part edition of Little Women, including Good Wives. I think I've been talking about both of them on this channel since my very first video last September. And I suspect I have many more rereadings of both books in my future. Before I finish, I want to tag a few people who have fairly small channels and are all wonderful. Go check them out. Wendy at BookNerdTV, Ange with an E, Hamsavahini, Ben at Doomantidote, Ed at Gagging for Lit, Kristin is reading, and Rainier at Rainier Books. I hope y'all will forgive me if I've not pronounced your name correctly, and I hope you'll also feel free to leave me pronunciation advice in the comments. Thanks, Roz, for this fantastic tag, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. See you soon on Hannah's Books.